Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamed of the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemet, currently in an Ottoman prison in Jaffa, Israel. And joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Schechter Day School of Long Island, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky, somewhere on the west side of New York City.
Elliot, do you remember that movie Midnight Express? In a Turkish prison. You are technically in.
Technically, although if
He wants Turkish
only
prison.
had it this way, it would be a big day. At any rate, we want to thank everyone for joining us. Before we begin, we got to say we're checking the stats. We've got at least 150, maybe 200 people watching us all over the world, and that's pretty amazing. If we keep growing like this, we're going to get to 250 by the end of the decade.
We'll have to find a bigger studio.
Indeed. Okay, I would be remiss if I didn't say that this is an amazing Parsha. Parshat NASO. NASO, we are in the second Parsha in the book of Bamidbar. But in addition to being the second Parsha of the book of the Bamidbar, it is the longest Parsha of the entire Torah. I have the statistics here. It comes in at, it is 2,264 words, the longest of all of the Parshiot, 176 psukim, and we will talk about that shortly as to why that is, what constitutes the biggest part of this Parsha. But before we get to that, we have some important material in this Parsha. Firstly, some unfinished business of last week, namely the tasks of the various Levitical clans. As we know, the tribe of the Levites was divided into three Levitical clans: Kahat, Gershon, and Merari. Last week, at the end of Bamidbar, the Torah tells us that Kahat, their function was to be to the maintenance of all of the sacred vessels. We have Gershon, the textiles, Merari, the beams and the wood. So you have a picture of these three Levitical clans transporting all of these things, and this Parsha really tells us later on in the Parsha exactly how they're to do this. They're to cover this, and they get special animals and wagons to transport this. All of that, which is fascinating in its own right. But we want to move on to some other items that are important in this Parsha. Namely, we have the Sotah and the Nazir. The Sotah, which we would define as the suspected adulteress, and the Nazir, the Nazirite, the person who dedicates himself, herself, to the service of God through both restrictions in cutting hair and also in drinking certain liquids. So let's talk about the Sotah. First, I'm going to turn to you, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky.
Sotah. Well, first of all, it's definitely one of the weirder parts of the Torah. I think modern people, you look at it and it looks like something like a trial by ordeal. So here's what goes on. The man is seized by a ruach kin'ah, a spirit of jealousy, and I think that the Torah is speaking about a kind of madness. He's jealous and he suspects that she has been unfaithful, but given the nature of this particular kind of transgression, there's no witnesses. So he is caught in a trap between his own jealous rage, but his inability to prove it, and she's telling him that she didn't do it. And so he takes her to the temple. There's a kind of potion, the dust of the tabernacle, plus a curse is written out, and the ink is blotted off the paper or parchment or whatever into the water, mixed with the dirt of the tabernacle. She drinks it, and if she is guilty, she hears the curse that is given. If she is guilty, some spectacular, terrible thing is to happen to her, and her guilt is out. And if nothing bad happens to her, she's proven innocent. So it looks like a trial by ordeal. It looks kind of,
strange,
primitive or whatever. Strange, certainly. I think it is helpful to often think about the Torah, some of the legislation in the Torah, something that you might and this being a prime example, something that you might look at and say, oh, this is terrible. How can the Torah legislate this? I think it's often helpful to think of something as a reform as opposed to a perfect kind of legislation of what we want. So I'm going to interpret the Sotah ritual in the following way. Men, they're typically more powerful than women in this patriarchal society, and he suspects her of adultery. Maybe he's going to do something terrible on his own vigilante authority to this woman who worries him. So instead, the Torah says you can't do anything on your own authority. You have to take her to the public institution. You're going to take her to the tabernacle. You're going to turn her over to the priest, and the priest is going to do something which very likely it could result in her exposure to guilt, but it very likely will result in her being proven innocent. And you can put this back together again, as opposed to destroy it terribly. Maybe that's a kind of generous interpretation because the way the rabbis tell this story in Tractate Sotah, like she's really kind of abased. She's kind of, her hair is messed up. This is in the Torah too. Her hair is messed up and her shirt is taken off, and so she's exposed to nakedness. It's not lovely. Doesn't seem gentle or nice, the way the rabbis tell it. But I think that the point of what is going on is to restrain what might otherwise be like really despotic or violent impulses of this husband caught in rage, and force him to do so in an orderly, like legal manner, turning it over to somebody who's got more power than he does, that is to say the priest. And then if he's lucky, she's proven innocent, and then she's promised that they will have a new child together.
So in other words, it channels. I learned this word here in Israel this time. I was asking someone, how do you say to channel something? That is to channel your anger. Lita'el from ta'ala. It's fascinating. So there is a ti'ul here, a channeling of the irrational, the rage, the zeal of the suspecting husband, channeling that into an orderly set of rituals here. I just want to add one point, and perhaps you could speak to this, or Barry, you could speak to this, that you have here echoes of another betrayal, and that is a betrayal that took place at Mount Sinai. Maybe you want to talk to it and see if you can, establish the parallelism or the similarity between Ma'amad Har Sinai and the betrayal of Klal Yisrael there and the Sotah. So that might be a Jeremy point, but I'll get Barry in on this.
Barry, you want to go?
Yeah, I'll go. But before I go, I wanted to add one point that it's important, I think, to keep in mind, in addition to the points that Jeremy raised, that the ritual in part is designed to restore a lack of trust, which once trust is broken, it's very difficult to rebuild it. And what you said, Jeremy, is that this protects the woman who might end up dead by the act of her husband, right? The jealous rage, I think you implied, at least if not thinking it outright, might kill the woman in this jealous rage. But the solution from a nonviolent point of view would be divorce. In the ancient world, certainly that was the grounds for divorce, was adultery. And I think that the ritual is in fact in place in part because the husband doesn't quite want to get divorced, that perhaps there is something left in this relationship that can be repaired. And I think part of the bizarreness of the ritual is to suggest that when trust is broken, God help us. And that's what the ritual is designed to do. It's God who's going to tell us that the woman is innocent or guilty. And this, in part, I think, is what the ritual of Sotah has in common with the golden calf. The golden calf, I think, in the Torah and in later Jewish writing, is the great sin of the Jewish people. And it is a betrayal of God. And the remedy, in part, was for Moses to ground up this golden calf into dust and force the people to drink it.
Mix it with water, yeah.
Mix it with, right. Yes, very important, very important point. Yes, you can't drink gold dust without a little bit of water to,
The gold dust solution.
yes. And I think that this is echoed in the Sotah, where the drink also is composed with something that is ground up or something that is literally ground, as Jeremy said. And, you know, I don't know how often we think about betrayal. We've all been betrayed or betrayed others, not necessarily on such a grand scale in the course of our lives. We do things that we shouldn't do. Sometimes they're more innocuous than others. And it is hard to figure out what to do. And it may be that ritual is the only way to get past it.
So that again, it channels all of that and enables a process of reparation for that. Okay, so for that we move to the Nazir, which is a really extraordinary individual within the structure of the Torah. We have a few examples of Nazirim in Tanakh, namely.
We only have two, though, right?
We have two. I think there's two. Well, Shmuel, is Shmuel a Nazir or
Shmuel's Nazirish.
Nazirish?
Yeah, it's
so Nazirite, is that what you're suggesting?
And Shimshon is which
It's
by the way,
definitely a
Torah for this week. Shimshon is the real Nazir. But it's funny because Samson, Shimshon, is he's like a tremendously, interesting character, but there's nothing about him that's like reverent and devotional. Like, Numbers portrays the Nazir as, somebody who's really, doing this to make a vow to God, and implies that there's a kind of reverence and spirituality to it. Shimshon is, with the exception of the fact that he doesn't drink, he's like a drunken bull. Like, he's always getting into scrapes and he's getting in trouble.
He's a wild man.
He's a wild man.
What's interesting, though, is that Shimshon and Shmuel, to the extent that he is a Nazir, are both Nazirim by birth.
Yes.
Right? It was not their choice. So it could be that they are the polar opposites, that not everyone can do this, but if the person doesn't have a choice, it really puts a tremendous burden on them.
So I was going to say, so what the Torah is really telling us is that there are individuals like this who, to use this word, that need to be channeled in certain directions. There are people that have excessive zeal or excessive desire for pious behaviors. What do you do with such a person?
So, I think it's really interesting that, as a general rule, Rabbinic Judaism is moderate. It likes discussion. It doesn't like eccentricity that much. It wants everybody to behave in really, common meaning, like held in public, possession. We want to behave in the ways that we all behave. We'll kind of be the same, and it's very suspicious of zeal. And the Nazir, I think like a little bit of zeal, brings a little excitement to religion. And if everything is just sort of, moderate, middle of the road stuff, it's a little boring. And the Nazir does bring us a little bit of excitement. Somebody who says, for 30 days, which is the standard Nazirite vow, or it could be longer. And some people are Nazirites to their lives, as one of the Rav Kook's famous followers, of David Kohen, the Nazir Yerushalmi, was a Nazirite for the rest of his life after he took his vow. Like, they're kind of religious nuts, and they bring some excitement because they take it so intensely. A little intensity is good. A lot of intensity is a little ragged.
Right, but the ritual, again, at the end of the Nazirship, suggests that it's difficult for society to control the Nazir. The Torah does what it can to put some constraints on the Nazir. You have the limited term, and there are. It's always interesting. They have to bring as a sacrifice at the end, the chatat, because the Torah is not entirely comfortable with the actual impulse that led to becoming a Nazir. But while you're talking, Jeremy, I was thinking about if we have this concept of Nazirite in our own day. And I think in a lot of situations, we see, and not just in Judaism, that people tend to show a certain deference to people that they perceive to be more religious than them. And very rarely do we see the fervent person, the zealous person, defer to the one who is less zealous. And I'm reminded there's this curious story of a prominent Orthodox rabbi whose son had a different standard of kashrut, so he wouldn't eat in his mother's house, which seems to me to be wrong on all sorts of different levels on one hand, but on the other hand, we tend to say it's okay because this person is more pious. And so we let that person be more pious, when maybe what we should be saying is that this person is more pious should lessen perhaps his or her piety to be like the rest of us.
Right. So it leads you to the question of what do you do with such a person? Do you honor and revere that person for their piety, or do you try and at least marginalize and neuter them? And I don't think there's.
We're waiting for you to tell us.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna just say there's no clear-cut answer here. Obviously,
A little bit of each is totally necessary, right? Like, if you, at one level, the beauty of a halachic system, we all should behave, in a similar way. We should all, share common norms. And if I really choose to observe kashrut in such and such a way, but it causes, it destroys shalom bayit, it destroys kibud av v'em, it's an insult to my parents. You have to say, listen, it's not about you, it's about us, and this is how we do it. And in a different moment, you'll be able to do it how you want, but now this is about us. So please subordinate your particular immediate plan to the good of the group.
Do you
And
think
that's great. And we also I think we appreciate that, free spirits have to soar, and there's something special about making room as a society for a little bit of eccentricity.
do you think that this is something relating
Oh,
to
yeah.
adolescence, to a certain adolescent male at an age, where they really have
No, I would disagree for this reason. I think what struck me when Jeremy was talking was his emphasis on the rabbis being moderate.
Yeah.
And the first mission in Pirkei Avot, the first thing that is said is havu mitunim badin. You should be moderate in judgment, which we often understand in the legal sense, but maybe it's meant in the social sense as well, that we have to conduct ourselves moderately, not veer too much to one extreme or the other.
All right. So with that, we want to just make a subtle transition to what is admittedly the largest portion of this portion. But before that, we have Birkat Kohanim. So I'm going to turn to our resident Kohen here. All right. This is V'samut Shmi, placing the name. We've talked about it before, but again, take us into the drama here, the placing of God's name on the people, and your channeling of the blessing. The Kohanim are channeling God's blessing to the people, and how does it work?
Just the fact that we, first of all, I appreciate also the vocabulary lesson, which is now a word that I will use, and ta'alat Suez. There's speaking of, like, that's the canal, right? The Suez
Right.
Canal. So lita'el, good to know. And here we are, just a couple of days after Shavuot, and because I'm on sabbatical at my conservative synagogue, we don't do Birkat Kohanim, like probably 99% of conservative synagogues, but I'm on sabbatical, so I went to a couple of Orthodox synagogues, and I got to recite the blessing when I was in Israel for Pesach. I got to recite the blessing, and it is really, it's not that I legit think that, God expects my caste, my familial caste, we have a power of blessing that the rest of you don't have. That doesn't really make a ton of sense to me, but that feeling that you get when you go up there and you say the blessing, Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech olam asher kiddushanu b'kedushato shel Aharon, you sanctified us with Aaronite holiness, v'tzivanu levarech et amo Yisrael, you commanded us to bless the people of Israel be'ahava, with love. And I have that feeling, summon up my love and beneficence and say, Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. And it is a super high. It really is, every time I do it, a super high moment. And I just sort of get in touch with my best wishes for people. So what we have here is this, I think of it, it's not exactly a haiku, but it's like a haiku, 3 lines, 3 words, 5 words, 7 words, 60 letters in all. And Aaron is supposed to, he raised his hands, he said the blessing on the people. Interestingly, we talked before the show began, it's a little hard to know what the chronology is back at the end of Exodus, back at the beginning of Leviticus, and again now we're talking about different acts that were done to dedicate the tabernacle. The way the Mefarshim, at least most of them, the Bible commentators put it together, what we have is something like the following. What we saw back in Leviticus 9, when Nadav and Avihu have the zapping incident, that what happened, that was the 8th day of the dedication of the tabernacle, but it was the 1st day of the month of Nisan. Aaron raises his hand and does the blessing. The divine presence becomes visible. The fire comes out and eats the sacrifices, but then unfortunately comes and consumes Nadav and Avihu too. The Rashi and Ibn Ezra, the commentators say, okay, that's where we are now. When these gifts begin here in Numbers chapter 7, we're on that day. So when it says Birkat HaKohanim at the end of number 6, and then begins with the gift on number 7, there's a nice, it fits the narrative back from Leviticus. Birkat HaKohanim, then the dedication of the dedication of the altar, and that's what we have here too.
What I would add here is that in Bamidbar and Parashat NASO, Birkat Kohanim comes after the discussion of the Nazir. And the Nazir represents a kind of zeal, what we might say perhaps more colloquially is passion. And passionate love at that high level cannot endure. What you need is some kind of moderated love. And the Kohen in the blessing, as it comes to us in Parashat NASO, is a tempering influence on the Nazir, and then allows the gifts to take place. And the striking feature about the gifts is that each prince brings exactly the same thing. The only thing that changes is the name.
All right, before we get into that, I just need to review the chronology here, because we have the dedication of the sanctuary, which took place back in the book of Vayikra. And we know that on the 8th day of the dedication, a terrible catastrophe happened where Nadav and Avihu were incinerated. And then the Torah tells us here that it's Biyom Kalot Moshe, it's the day that the completion of the sanctuary dedication. So we have, let's just move like frame by frame here. The sanctuary is dedicated. We know that the sanctuary was dedicated on the first of Nisan. The 8th day then is the 1st of Nisan. That's a day of a catastrophe. The first gift on the first day of the gifts is the gift of Nachshon ben Amidav. So I want to ask you just to give me a little sermon here about Nachshon. What would be the task of Nachshon on the first day of giving, knowing that a terrible event, a catastrophe has happened where everything that was supposed to be great kind of fell apart because of the strange offering of Nadav and Avihu, their incineration. So there's a real sense of awe and also fear among the people. We could say it's Nachshon is the first presenter, but maybe this task would be to all the presenters. So let's talk about this. I'm going to turn to you, Jeremy, about this.
Wait, can I ask you one question also? I'm trying to remember. Aaron's wife, Elisheva, is she Nachshon's sister?
There you go. Yeah, she's Nachshon's sister, right?
So Nachshon is, in addition to being the prince of Yehuda, he's also the uncle.
He's the uncle of the two deceased priestlies.
Wow, I forgot about that, and I think that's right, but I don't exactly remember. I think that Elisheva is Bar Aminadav.
That's correct.
Okay, so
His
that makes it
sister.
even more intense. Well, what does everybody know about Nachshon? They know that famous piece of midrash that when the people were too scared to, you asked for a sermon, so I'm going to come up with one.
Please.
When the people were too scared to enter into the raging seas of Yam Suf, and they thought they were going to drown, Nachshon goes, Acharai, after me, here we go, and we can do this. And if that's the case, then you would be tempted to bring a little bit of that midrashic theme to this one, which is there are moments in which it looks like we're trapped and we cannot go forward, and he's going to come along and say, we've planned for this. God has thrown us a tremendous curveball, but we're still going to hew to the path. Then maybe this relates to the whole this whole thing we've been talking about, excessive zeal or halachic regularity. Maybe Nadav and Avihu are Nazirites. Maybe they are prophets. Maybe they are zealots. And then Nachshon comes back to rabbinic moderation and says, guys, you got a mitzvah. This is what we planned. I've got 130. I've got a 70 shekel silver mizrak. I've got a 10 gold shekel spoon, and I'm filled it with incense. And we're doing what we planned.
We're all frozen
So
here.
what's interesting here is how different pieces of the Torah come together. What's interesting is how different pieces of the Torah come together. So we recall Nachshon from Parshat Bamidbar. He is the chieftain of Yehuda, which is the largest tribe, but is also the tribe that leads the Israelites in their march in the wilderness, because Judah is in front, flanked, I think, by Yisachar and Zvulun. And so Nachshon is the leader. As Jeremy mentioned, he's also a quasi-mourner. And what struck me, Jeremy, when you were talking about perhaps Nadav and Avihu being zealots, is we know from elsewhere that they did not have children. They were not married. So that also goes in with the zealot. Perhaps someone thinking in modern terms that the line ends with me because I am the gift of God, and the Torah is saying maybe not so fast, and they are eliminated. But there is, I was thinking when you brought up Nadav and Avihu that it's hard to imagine how the Israelites knew actually what happened to them, right? Because the image that we have is they're in the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest can go in, not even a regular priest. And so how would the Israelites even hear of this tragedy?
They weren't in the Holy of Holies. They were bringing their incense pans from outside to the holy area, and the fire went out of.
So this is a fire of the altar, right?
Exactly.
That's in the Chatzer.
No, yes, the fire is ignited and comes out and burns them in addition to that. Okay.
So what is necessary then, and in fact, one of the things that Shiva does is an attempt to restore order.
Indeed.
And nothing could be more ordered than this list of gifts, which, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, goes on longer than any other chapter in the Torah.
Right. And I guess it functions then as a transition. I mean, we have 12 tribes and we have 12 days. It would be great if we had 7 or 8 or what, those are, other symbolic numbers, but 12 obviously is the archetypal symbolic number for tribes. So we move through a whole cycle of them, which obviously would include a Shabbat. But we've remarked, I think, in the past about the regularity of the the passage. The passage has a certain music to it. All you need to do is learn the basic trup of it and just substitute the name of a tribal chieftain on each successive day. The music, I think the music itself lends some meaning to this. It's a song. And the song, at least to me, suggests some joy.
Well, as Sherry Lewis would say, this is the song that never ends.
but it does, and
So did her.
It just feels that
guess,
way.
like
It does. It's not ever never ending. It just feels that way.
it feels that way. But okay, so we're there is an arc to this song that you kind of get to somewhere, around the sixth or seventh day. That is after having said, ביום ראשון קורבנות, קרא כסף אחד, 70 מאה, 30 מאה, משקלה, מזרק אחד כסף, da-da-da-da. And you're chanting it, and you would chant it much better than I just did, obviously. But there's music to it. The music is a song. The song conveys some joy, as any regular chorus to any song does. And the fact that you do it 12 times at least reminds me of the same experience that you would have with Echad Mi Yodea, which is at least 12 stanzas, 13 stanzas more, right? And Chad Gadya, also a similar number of stanzas. Of course, the words are different, but we sing the melody and we delight in it. And I think that, given this moment in the book of Bamidbar, we're transitioning, I guess, from this catastrophe to a sense that we are moving, and we're going to move. And as we know, things are going to really go downhill from here. So I'm going to suggest that the climax of this whole chapter really is the last verse of the Parsha. Jeremy, you want to speak to the last verse of the Parsha for a second, which really tells us something extraordinary has just happened here. And that will be a good way to culminate our talk here.
Culminate. So the Parsha ends after all of these, after the entire collection of all the gifts, and it's 12 silver bowls and 12 silver basins and 12 gold ladles, and there's 130 is the weight of the bowls, and 70 is the weight of the basins, and then the total silver comes to 2,400 sanctuary shekels and 120 gold ladles, and all the incense and all the animals and the bulls and the rams and the lambs. And so then it tells us what's the tabernacle for. And so number 7, longest chapter in the Chumash, Numbers chapter 7, verse 89. That's a lot of verses. 89. Ubivo Moshe el Ohel Moed, and when Moses would come into the tent of meeting, Lidaber ito, to speak with him, capital H, him, God. Vayishma et hakol midaber elav me'al hakaporet, and he would hear the voice speaking to him from above the cover of the ark, asher al aron haidut mi ben shnei akruvim, from between the two cherub statues, vaydaber elav, and he would speak to him. Hebrew's a little hard with the he, and you never know exactly who the he is, but there's the word Moses, vayishma et hakol, Moses hears the voice, midaber. It's spelled in a slightly different way than you expect, and you have to kind of pay attention. It's just a dot, but it's an important dot. There's a dagesh, a dot in the daled. In modern Hebrew, it's not even like bet, vet, or pei, fei. It doesn't affect even Ashkenazi with the taf and the saf. It doesn't affect. We're not accustomed to seeing a dot in the daled, although in ancient times it meant something. But we don't, for the word midaber, for God speaking, we wouldn't have a dagesh in the daled. And so why is there one? So Rashi says that Rashi explains this odd spelling by saying that midaber means mitdaber, which is grammatically sensible, meaning that God was speaking to himself. So Moses hears the voice of God, midaber elav. It doesn't mean speaking to Moses. It means speaking to himself. God is just Godding, God is meditating on divinity itself. And so the revelation that Moses is portrayed here in this verse, the revelation that Moses is portrayed to be receiving when he goes into the Ohel Moed is like overhearing God speaking to himself. And I just think that this is a tremendously interesting, spiritually, theologically reflective. It's not just that God from heaven says, don't eat pork. It's that God is a spiritual being that is reflective, it's like eternity and infinity reflecting in on itself. And Moses to be the ultimate spiritually perceptive prophetic figure is to hear infinity speak to itself. I find that pretty poetic.
So what it makes of the gifts then is that it restores God's place in the world, which is in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. And so after the great tragedy with Nadav and Abihu, when we might think that God has abandoned us as Israelites, we hear that God is still with us.
So I want to just take a different look at this and say that if at this moment Moses is hearing God's internal conversation, that means that there's a disconnect, would you say, between God and Moses at this point? It's that God is not speaking directly to Moses, that if Moses is overhearing God's internal conversation, there is a dip here in the relationship. I can't help but think that. And that is as lovely as it is, theologically, to think of the human being being that perceptive, to hear the reverberation of the internal divine monologue. I kind of want them to be speaking to each other. I don't want them not to be speaking to each other. I want this relationship, and of course, I mean, what it suggests is that this relationship goes through different phases, as every relationship does, obviously.
I don't, maybe this is the, we've had this conversation over the years in different ways in the past. There's a way in which, like, I really incline to mysticism in a way that doesn't speak to you in the same way. There's a great midrash in Shmot Rabbah that just, having you just been up in the Galil, it's I don't know that it's speaking davka about Rosh Hanikra, but it could be. There's a midrash in Shmot Rabbah that says like this. Sometimes it says Vayidaber Moshe el Adonai, and sometimes it says Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe. And Mashal Amar, what's this like? It's like a cave by the ocean. Sometimes the ocean water surges in and fills the cave, and sometimes the cave water surges back out and enters the ocean, and the one goes in and the one goes out, and after a while you cannot determine which is the cave water and which is the ocean water. Like it's the divine mind and the human mind kind of flowing together. And so this, on a mystical level, this kind of speaks to me like that it's not, I would not think of this as a diminishment because it's like indirect. I would think of it as a kind of a mystical participation that's maybe even, it's certainly no less direct.
A fascinating set of images and a fascinating conversation about this truly amazing Parsha, filled with so much material and so many verses, so much to think. You'll probably spend a lot of time listening to it in shul if you are there this Shabbat. So on behalf of my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Rabbi Jeremy Kalinowski, Shalom from Jerusalem, from Israel, I'm in Tel Aviv. Okay. Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you again next week on the future edition of Parsha Talk. Bye-bye.